Right, hi everyone. As I mentioned in class, this tutorial is not really a tutorial, it's going to be a brief lecture. I think there are about 10 slides, and then there's an activity that I want you to do sometime over break and upload an image related to this activity to Blackboard. So the topic is atmospheric perspective. If we look at this first image, this is not really an art image. I just searched online for landscape images that people were sharing on Wikipedia. And this particular image is in Portugal, and I think it's a really excellent example of atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is the sense of depth that we get when we look out at a landscape and stuff that is far from us, it is obscured by atmosphere. So scientifically, the light waves that are coming from that stuff very far away, that light is being scattered by the molecules that are in the air. So when it gets to us, especially if there's a lot of water vapor, then that stuff is obscured. And here we see that really clearly as we look to these hills or mountains in the background. They're quite they've been lightened, they're kind of grayed out. And the key thing I want to, I will say a couple times during this presentation, is that it's not just that whatever's in the background is getting grayer or lighter, it is really a change in contrast. So if we look in the foreground here, we can see that we have both the darkest darks and the lightest light. So we have this white from what appears to be snow or sand, and then we have darks from these shadows. When we move back into the middle of this photograph, so kind of the second, this is the first zone, maybe like the closest zone to us. If we go to this middle ground, like the second zone of this picture, you can see that the darks aren't quite as dark and the lights are not quite as light as the lights here. And then when we move back to the third zone in the background, we get a sense that there's very, very little contrast. So everything is in the middle. If we think about our gradation scale from class, we are in the 2-3 zone. So atmospheric perspective is not only an actual property of the way that we see the world, but it's a tool that artists use to create depth in drawing and painting. Here we see a painting by Leonardo da Vinci from the 16th century, from the Italian Renaissance. And just like with that photograph, we see that the figures in the foreground, figure of Virgin and Child with St. Anne and this little lamb, they're in pretty high contrast. We have the lightest lights and we also have dark shadows. However, when we move to the background to this kind of rocky landscape, this next image is from a 19th century book of natural illustrations. Why I like this is because it's similar to that first photographed in that there are we could see like 3 zones. So the first one being the high contrast foreground, that would include the leaves and maybe a couple of these are army worms. I also included it because it's just totally weird and interesting. Anyway, high contrast. Then we move into this middle ground where we see these worms in some of the landscape, but again, the contrast is slightly less. And then we move into the background here where we have very low contrast. This next image is a drawing by the American artist Thomas Eakins. This is a preparatory drawing for a really famous painting. And why I included this one is because here we have atmospheric perspective being used in a very exaggerated way. So here this technique is used to make this space seem large and to focus our attention on the foreground. To give you a little bit of background, if you're just wondering about this image, this is how surgeries were conducted at this time. And this is a kind of classroom environment where all these people are here watching this surgeon. And then we have this family member cowering in the background. Yeah, kind of strange image, but anyway, let me just point out again, the high contrast here, medium level of contrast, and then low contrast. The next slide I have shows that in a diagram. Darkest darks, lightest lights, most detail here, and the figure, and these implements here. Middle ground, looks like this guy's a stenographer or something. Then we have this other person. So these two figures, less detail, less contrast in the foreground, but still more so than the background that has very small shifts in value. Here we have an example from a former student of mine. This is similar to what we're going to do as the next project. It's going to be an ink drawing of a landscape. Here we see this birch tree. It's in high contrast with dark shadows and light highlights. We look to the middle ground, we see these bushes and these trees. This is taken, I believe, from a Japanese garden type setting. So here we have an area of middle contrast, and then if we go to the background, everything is very light in tone. So it's very little contrast. So I have two more examples. This one I showed in class when I was talking about value. And not only is this a good example of using line plus wash to create value, it also shows a nice sense of atmosphere because of the high contrast with this tree and the low contrast with this background. And then another example of kind of a false atmospheric perspective, or the tool of atmospheric perspective being used in a way where this would not actually, it's not a realistic way that it's used, but it's used to create a sense of narrative or to exaggerate or focus our eyes on these particular figures in this composition. To give you a little bit more background, Daumier was a French artist who was also a satirist, so this appears to be, he's kind of making fun of these guys who are connoisseurs of this artwork. But again, I probably don't need to restate this, but these figures here and these paintings or drawings in the foreground, we have high contrast here. Then we move to these figures in the background, very sketchy, very light, so it seems like they're on the other side of the room. What I'd like to do for this assignment, and again, this can be uploaded today or tomorrow, or it can just be done sometime before class, the Monday after break. But I want you to go out and take a photograph that shows atmospheric perspective. And this can either be a true atmospheric perspective, you look out to a landscape and you see some hills, or you see something in the background that seems a lighter or less contrast than the foreground. Or it can be something that is more simulated. So, for example, you are looking out a window or something like that, where a kind of atmospheric effect is created, even though it's not truly atmospheric perspective. So just take that photograph, upload it to Blackboard. You may also use this photo for the next project to draw from, or you can work in and around the drawing building or the St. Joe's. So it's going to be a little hard because obviously it's still quite cold outside. There are a couple locations where you can look out, especially those two windows in the studio that look out to the trees and the hill behind there. So that's a really nice spot that has that quality of zones. Whether you include the window in the drawing or not, there still is that sense of the trees being in front of the hills. And there are some other areas where that could be done around St. Joe's. So it's up to you. If you do want to work from a photograph, you should have it with you in class so you get started on it that Monday. And just something better than a phone screen, so a print or a laptop screen or something like an iPad would be good enough. And that is all. So again, just please take this image. Perhaps while you're traveling, you could just be conscious of the landscape as you travel, and I know most of you are going places next week, and hopefully you will stumble upon a situation that is a really clear example of atmosphere. Okay, I hope you all have a good and relaxing break. See you next week.